Morning. I'm Leila Abed, Acting Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, and on behalf of the Mexico and Canada Institutes and the WAVA Institute for Strategic Competition, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, USMCA at 4, Measuring Success, Addressing China, and Working Towards the 2026 Review. Since coming into force 4 years ago on July 1st, 2020, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement has produced remarkable results for all three countries. The USMCA's legal and regulatory framework has expanded trade, investment, and jobs, and has provided mechanisms to resolve trade disputes. In 2023, the total value of trade within North America exceeded $1.88 trillion, positioning Mexico and Canada as the U.S. top trading partners for the first time since 2002, surpassing China. Goods and services trade within North America soared by 50%, and investment in new ventures grew by 136%. The fourth anniversary of USMCA offers a unique opportunity for the three parties involved to reflect on the positive results achieved and the challenges that may arise, especially ahead of the 2026 USMCA review, and with elections in Mexico, the United States, and Canada potentially signifying political shifts that could also impact trade in North America. It would be very interesting to monitor what comes in the next 2 years. I will take this opportunity to share that the Mexico Institute's Advisory Board Co-Chair, Ambassador Tony Wayne, and the Wilson Center's Burson Foster Scholar, Diego Marroquin, have written an outstanding brief analyzing many of the issues I just mentioned, as well as other important matters related to USMCA. For those interested in reading the brief, you can access the document on the Mexico Institute's website. I also want to reference that you can access a publication written by one of our speakers today, Juan Carlos Baker, on the triangular balance between the US, Mexico, and China. Our speakers that join us today will delve into many topics, including North America integration, the USMCA review, Chinese investment in Mexico, alignment of policies, compliance with the agreement, dispute settlement mechanisms, the political climate in all three countries, and many others. I would like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights and knowledge with our audience this morning. And now I turn it over to Diego Marroquin, who will provide further information, facts, and figures on USMCA. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Lila. That was a fantastic introduction. And you cover a lot of ground already. I want to thank as well the Canada Institute, both Mexico and Canada Institute staff. We wouldn't be doing this webinar with them, and a fantastic publication that just came out. I wanted to provide some figures just to set the tone of the conversation a little bit. Like Lila has done a great job already. But again, as Lila said, I think USMCA has undergone a trial by fire and still has delivered remarkable results. Lila was saying, for example, that with USMCA, Mexico, the US, and Canada trade over $3.6 million each minute. If we look at this webinar, for example, that's supposed to be an hour long, that means that for the duration of the webinar, the US, Mexico, and Canada would trade over $200 million in an hour. We have to be mindful again that ongoing national elections, as exemplified by current developments in Mexico, can introduce policy and reform proposals that could profoundly impact USMCA. And this could also happen in the US and Canada that are also having elections very soon. One example of this is, again, former President Trump's suggestion about a flat 10% tariff on all imports, including including Mexico and Canada. So closely monitoring these developments in the coming months will be essential. But let's look at USMCA again. What are the key metrics behind USMCA success? We have trade, we have jobs, we have investment, and we have trade disputes resolution. In trade, again, US trade with Canada and Mexico is 200% higher than US trade with China in the first 4 months of 2024. When it comes to jobs, for example, USMCA has boosted job creation in North America. It now supports over 17 million jobs. That is a 32% increase compared to 2020. For example, when it comes to investment, again, USMCA has played a big role in making the US and Canada the top global destinations for foreign direct investment. For example, in 2023, the US attracted $300 billion in FDI, and Canada attracted $50 billion. Mexico lagged behind a little bit and only attracted $37 billion. It's still a record amount, with almost 50% originating from the US and Canada. But that also means that Mexico is lagging behind other Latin American countries like Brazil that attracted $66 billion in the same period. We need to be mindful again that 13% of Mexico's FDI in 2023 came from new ventures and 87% came from reinvestments. These also highlights criticism from Mexico's current investment environment, containing barriers that prevent the country to reach its full potential. And that's something that hopefully we'll get to talk about a little bit today. Nevertheless, the picture is really bright. Greenfield investment in North America, as Lila said, rose 136% since USMCA was implemented, reaching 190 billions in 2023. And if we looked at USMCA from a dispute resolution perspective, there's been multiple state-to-state disputes that have been resolved so far, ranging from issues like solar panels, oil and gas, and agricultural trade. But it is really important to note that some of these issues haven't been resolved, and we need to find solutions to them before the 2026 review. For example, there's a pending case on Mexico's energy policies and practices, another case on Mexico's approach to genetically modified corn. There's been multiple cases regarding dairy trade between the US and Canada, and I think most importantly is a case regarding rules of origin in the auto sector, where the US has already lost a panel, and it's been over almost 2 years, and the case hasn't been resolved. As Lila said, in 2 years' time, the three countries will have to sit down and confirm in writing whether they want to continue or not with the agreement. Continuing with the agreement would be something very positive for the region, because we would keep this positive momentum that we built over the past 4 years. A non-successful review would not necessarily upend North American trade as we know it, would definitely have negative consequences for the three countries. And there are at least 3 risks that we should be mindful about and should we work on solutions toward them. I think number 1 is USMCA compliance. As I said, there was a panel, for example, on automotive rules of origin. It's been over 500 days and the US hasn't made any announcement regarding they want to comply or not with the panel or not. There's the second risk, for example, are policy reforms in the 3 countries, particularly in Mexico. As some of you know, López Obrador has proposed a series of constitutional reforms, such as eliminating autonomous regulators, reforming state energy industries, and banning genetically modified corn. And those appear to contradict commitments under USMCA. It is still early, and there hasn't been a decision regarding those constitutional reforms, but they can very much risk the review in 2026. And lastly, and I think this is very important, and I hope that Juan Carlos talks a little bit more about this, is the rise of China and how the rise of China can reshape the future of USMCA. China has become a significant issue of bipartisan concern. I think, nevertheless, are other figures that show that these concerns are mostly overblown. Chinese investment in Mexico has risen, but it is significantly lower than US investment. I think it is 49 times smaller. What we should definitely avoid is unilateral actions on China that violate USMCA. I think at the 4-year mark, we have a really good opportunity to present counteroffers to Chinese investment and trade in the region, and to work together on issues of common concerns, including unfair trade practices from China, Chinese investment in telecoms infrastructure, for example, and in connected vehicles in the region. And I think this is going to help us set the conversation a little bit more. Just concluding, I think there's a recognition across the political, business, and civil society landscape that USMCA is the fundamental underpinning of our success. Canada, Mexico, and the US each contributes a piece of the puzzle that contributes to our collective achievements. I think the positives around USMCA shine brightly, but many challenges remain. And I think the challenge for the next 2 years is, will we be up for the challenge? And I think that the conversation is going to be moderated here by Ambassador Wayne, who's going to tell us a little bit more about that. Thank everyone for joining this webinar. And again, I want to thank the Mexico and Canada Institutes for helping us set this insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diego. That was great. And so again, I want to underscore, please take a look at the paper we just posted on the Mexico Institute Wilson Center webpage. We go into this in more detail, and very fortunately, we have an outstanding panel with us today of colleagues from Mexico and Canada. who have worked on these issues along with us for many years. Beatriz Lesegi, Laura Dawson, Meredith Lilly, Juan Carlos Baker. They're each going to offer some insights about what we should look at as priorities as we move over the next 2 years to this review of USMCA. I want to remind everybody that USMCA's review is unique. We did not have this in NAFTA. We really should have had something like this in NAFTA because as NAFTA dragged on, people were less and less serious about looking what was happening in that agreement. It's not easy to look at things that aren't working. Sometimes you have to be forced to do that. Well, all 3 countries and all the millions of stakeholders are going to be forced to look at that in 2026, look at those things and consider them. And so that does introduce an element of uncertainty, but it also introduces opportunities to improve what we're doing. And in this connection, I think it's also important to remember that one of the factors helping to attract this investment into North America are the steps that the 3 countries have taken domestically and bilaterally outside of USMCA, but consistent with that in order to enhance an agenda of making North America more competitive. You can see this in the cooperation that's going on in the semiconductor sector, where the private enterprise is working with the 3 governments actually to see how they can help promote a stronger semiconductor production network across North America. So it's the combination of having a good, solid trade framework along with collaboration in all of those areas around trade that add up to competitiveness, which include such things as workforce development, of special focus on innovation and providing support for R&D, many other things that go into this. And so North America has so far benefited from this kind of investment and this kind of legal steps that have been taken by the countries independently to support this. So let's look and at what should be the priorities now as we move into this run-up to the review for 2026. So let me invite Beatriz to make some initial comments, and we'll have initial comments by everybody. We'll have a little discussion, and we will also invite questions from the audience if you submit them. And Diego, where should they submit them again?
Sorry?
Any of the audience should submit their questions to the Mexico Institute.
Yes. And I think they can do it through the chat as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, Beatriz, por favor.
Okay, well, hi, good morning. Buenos dias. I thank the Wilson Center for the invitation, and I really want to congratulate Tony and Diego for the excellent paper. It couldn't be more timely, propositive, and have more metrics in it. So good job. I was asked by Diego and Tony to comment on what would be the path forward for the revision, of this, and I would like to comment 5 actions that could increase the possibilities of obtaining a positive outcome of the first revision of the USMCA. If that occurs, that would be renewed until 2036, 16 years. So it's very important. Which are those 5 actions that I propose? The first one, action 1, governments and stakeholders shall approach the USMCA revision with a North American mindset in opposition to an inward-looking one. And to achieve this, Mexico and Canada should reinforce their continued efforts to explain why their countries matter to the US and how the world developments since the USMCA came into force, such as wars, the pandemic, China-US continued trade tensions, have made the 3 countries further interdependent. They shall also emphasize the positive results of the USMCA at core. In this last task, I think it would be very helpful that companies of the three countries should produce case studies on the economic and social footprint of their activity in North America. I think that this kind of studies at the micro level could have a greater impact on the main actors than many times the general macroeconomic data that is usually provided. The second action is a greater alignment between Canada, Mexico, and the US domestic policies to address common challenges and matters, such as their industry's participation in supply chains, energy and water security, infrastructure and logistics, health crisis, and climate change. Matters that are not all covered in the USMCA, and that if addressed effectively and coordinated domestically, and through the bilateral and multilateral and regional level as well, would strengthen the cooperation and goodwill that is much needed among the teams in the revision process, while contributing to multiply the agreement's positive effects. Action 3, it is of extreme importance, I consider, that the USMCA parties comply with the USMCA commitments and the decisions derived from its dispute settlement mechanisms. Not doing so could be an obstacle in the renewal of the USMCA. Today, I consider that the legitimacy of the state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism is being seriously questioned. Mexico, as being the weakest party in the trilateral relationship, should strongly promote that disputes are resolved through the rule of law instead of power, and that the dispute settlement mechanisms of the USMCA function appropriately. This has become even more relevant today since the WTO dispute settlement mechanism is paralyzed. Action 4, USMCA parties and interested stakeholders should begin to identify and assess the issues of the USMCA worth revising in 2026, and prepare proposals to improve their implementation or effectiveness. Joint proposals from the private sectors of the three countries will have better chances, indeed, of being considered and adopted by the governments. It makes things much easier when the three stakeholders of the three countries, the stakeholders of the three countries come together in this. Participants, I think, should have in mind that 2026 revision has to do with how the agreement is working. It does not imply the reopening or renegotiation of its terms. Finally, Action 5 has to do with Mexico, on the need that it puts in place a comprehensive strategy to improve Mexico's perception in the region. And to do this, it should act, not only speak, and it should then adopt measures that provide greater legal certainty and security to producers and investors, that it observes the USMCA labor commitments, it conducts thorough assessment if the proposed package of constitutional amendments that are being shortly presented to Congress to assure that they are compatible with the USMCA. And finally, proposes further cooperation in key issues of great concern to the US, China, like is the China matter, immigration, and fentanyl. To conclude, I would say that if such actions are effectively implemented, they would not only contribute to a successful revision of the USMCA, but they would also help advance the North American integration and competitiveness agendas. Hopefully, our governments, entrepreneurs, civil society, and particularly our leaders in North America will conduct the USMCA revision with an outward, propositive, and visionary approach. Let's prove to the world that through this process that North America indeed exists. That which deceased Canadian professor Stephen Clarkson searched so hard for and did not find. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. If I could, Juan Carlos, could you now add some perspective?
Certainly. Thank you, Ambassador, for the opportunity. Thank you for the Wilson Center, Canada and Mexico Institutes both. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm very pleased to have this engagement because it gives us, it highlights a couple of things. First, I remember back in the day when the review, the modernization of the NAFTA was still an idea. I remember that many people coming to me and say, you know what, President Trump is not really going to go forward with that. It's just too complicated. People are not really going to buy into it. So he's not going to do it. So Mexico should just wait it out. So there was a great degree of disbelief back then that this could actually happen. Now, fast forward the movie 6 years, and we know how that ended. So it's very encouraging right now for me to see that this time around, people are really taking this issue seriously. I see now that there are open and very passionate discussions about the 2026 in Mexico, the US, and Canada, and what it means, how we should go about it, and so on. And let me connect my remarks with of those 5 great ideas that Beatriz was proposing. I think that the remarks that I prepared mostly relate to idea number 4, 3 and 4, which is, you know, how our stakeholders are going to approach the review. Because here we are right now discussing all of this, and as I said, it's very encouraging and it's very enlightening. But you know, we still have to hear from the governments. The governments, you know, there are some discussions that they are having. At least that's what's been reflected in some of the statements of the Free Trade Commission and the follow-up that the vice ministers do of the free trade priorities. But at least to my best knowledge, we are still discussing, countries are still discussing what is going to be the perimeter about under which those ideas and those proposals are going to be addressed or not. And that is important in my mind, at least for 3 reasons. One, we need to be very aware of how the rules of the game are going to be presented. And linking again this with what Beatriz said, certainly if the 3 associations of any given industry in North America are coming up with a single proposal, but if that proposal implies diminishing the level of commitments that the USMCA has, or if that proposal implies, you know, being more protectionist inside North America vis-a-vis third parties, well, we need to come up with a decision of how governments are going to take that. I mean, maybe we want to do that, maybe we don't want to do that, but again, it's not clear. So point number 1 is, what are the topics that will be discussed, how they will be addressed, and, you know, to put it very simply, what is allowed and what we will not be allowing to frame as a proposal. That's point number 1. Now, the second point that I also think it's important to keep in mind on this is, you know, what is the timeline for this? We know very well when is this going to start. We speak about the 2026 as if it was this milestone craved in everybody's mindset, but we don't really know how that review is going to end once that it has started. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, if we read by the letter what Article 34 says, it only says that, you know, parties will come to the table with a number of proposals. It doesn't say how many, by the way. It just says that parties will come to a proposal and they will discuss it. Those of us that have had interactions with the bureaucracy, let's put it like that, we know that what ministers are going to do probably is that they're going to take those proposals and they're going to be referred back to working groups and committees. Okay. And then what? I mean, are those working groups and committees going to take 6 months, 8 months, 1 year, 2 years? I mean, we just don't know that. And probably the commission doesn't know either. But, you know, signaling some transparency and some clarity there will be helpful, because if not, we know when the 2026 review is going to begin, but we just don't know when is it going to end. So we could probably be entering into this eternal loop of talks. And I know that other of my friends in the panel are going to speak about this, but then the politics are going to start playing into this. The process that Beatriz describes, that I would probably call my most optimistic scenario, you know, a process technically driven that is, you know, set with the right mindset, and people are very serious about what this is all about and so on. Maybe that scenario needs to come up with some of the political realities that exist in North America and will continue to exist. I have said in the past even in the Wilson, that it has always so graciously hosted me. But I have said in the past that it's a bit naive to believe that political priorities are not going to be inserted into the 2026 review. Now, that is just the way it is. We are probably going to have to cope with it. But to me, in that sense, the question is how many political priorities each country is really willing to entertain. If any country comes, Mexico to say any, comes and says that, of my 50 priorities that I bring to the table, I need all of them addressed somehow because all of them are important for my political balance in Mexico. Well, that's really is going to make things very complicated for everyone. So it's about the rules of the game for the proposal. It's about the timing, and it's also about what happens after and who's going to be responsible for this. No, I don't really want to take up a lot of time, but I just two topics that constantly come up, and one of them I wrote something for the Wilson. It's also available. Please take a look at it. Which is China. There are plenty of things that we have to do in North America, both from the domestic perspective, both from the regional perspective. But perhaps one of the most important one is to come up with an answer, a common answer to, what do we do about China? And this has always been very difficult for me to understand, because if we just looked at the political statements, it would seem as if, China secretly crept into North America without anyone noticing. And then suddenly one day we woke up to that reality. And that is just not the case. I mean, China has been present in North America for over 3 decades. And the reality is that it was in this paper that I quoted and Lila mentioned, I call that the Chinese policy by design, because, that's how we structure it. Among ourselves, we trade duty-free, we bring imports from other regions, in that case, China, and we just process them and we trade cheaply. We keep inflation down, and what the normal economic theory says that it was going to happen, but then it didn't, not entirely at least. So if that vision is no longer something that we share, okay, so which one is it? Is it this vision of rivalry and a challenge for hegemony that Washington sometimes feel is the right description? There was this poll by the Pew Research Center very recently that describes how China is perceived in several countries, and certainly Mexico doesn't seem to have the same perception vis-a-vis China that it happens in other countries as well. So China would be part of the review. I have no doubt of that. Diego also already mentioned this indirectly. But if we have to do that, or if we have to do something in that regard, there also is the angle of the industrial policy. We cannot do something about China without coming up with options. And that is also something that, in the case of Mexico, the US, and Canada, it's been conveniently sidelined. We have never really talked about a North American industrial policy. Indirectly, probably, the IRA and other pieces of legislation help, but that's not it. So I will stop here, Ambassador, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And just to remind everybody that, of course, yesterday, the United States and Mexico took a joint action approved by the 2 presidents to increase tariffs on steel and aluminum that was not melted down, not made in North America. And so this indeed was a sign of a collaborative approach to a threat to undermine both Mexican and US producers in this area. So it's an interesting way to see how they're handling that at this time. Laura, could I please invite you to share some of your priorities?
Great. Thanks very much, Tony. I'm grateful to be invited. This is a wonderful group, and I've always really enjoyed the work of both the Canada Institute and the Mexico Institute. So thanks for inviting me. Meredith is most likely going to do a deep dive into the Canadian issues. So I wanted to draw back a little bit and show my age as a long-term trade policy observer and historian. and make the observation that if we didn't already have the NAFTA USMCA, we probably wouldn't be able to achieve it now. It was an artifact of a particular time in our history and a particular set of beliefs about collective action, helping to generate national good. So when I hear people talk about this upcoming review as being simply an administrative review, that it will be fairly straightforward, we're not going to bring in anything new, I'm highly skeptical of that, especially if there's a Trump administration. I think the perspective there will be, it may be administrative for everybody else, but for what we already know about Trump and his approach to government, it will be an attempt to maximize US interests, to clear off irritants, and to gain increased leverage. So, can this agreement be saved? What are the elements of the history and trajectory of the NAFTA USMCA that we need to keep in mind, and how have attitudes towards regional trading blocs changed? And I think the first thing that we need to keep in mind is we are in a situation of deterioration of the principles of non-discrimination and collective action. And these are the things that are embedded in the GATT WTO system, which is an artifact of World War II, the post-war trading system, where we believed that individual nations could prosper within the framework of the collective good. Now, we're not naive. We knew that this system was led and architected by the US, but it was a first among equals situation. And so individual action was, folks were looking out for their own interests, but the primacy of the collective stood above that. And I think that has, been, I don't know if it's permanently eroded, but it's definitely taken some body blows. And we're in a situation now where individual protectionism, what we call industrial policy for the 21st century, trumps trade policy. And countries are looking to advance their domestic exemptions, domestic opportunities for a good cause. In Canada, we are attempting to protect the dairy industry, the digital services industry, et cetera, protect the dairy industry and go after the digital services industry. And I think we have lost the fundamental belief that a rising tide floats all boats. In the US, Trump's inner circle has put a premium on leverage. Under Trump, it was Make America Great. Under Biden, it was rebranded as looking out for the working man, but it was still a disposition towards domestic protectionism. In Canada, they call this sovereignty and independent policies. And so things like the digital service tax that depart from the collective herd for the sake of reflecting a distinct national approach have taken center stage, even if they hurt the economy overall. And I'm sure in Mexico, there's a one-word descriptor, whether leverage or sovereignty, for going your own way as well. So that's the first thing that I would point out. Second thing is institutional atrophy. NAFTA was never held together by very much. It relied on consensus, held together by institutions that were supposed to dive deeper into the emerging issues and to greenfield the agreement. But most of these institutions and committees have atrophied. They no longer meet. Very few of them meet, are not relevant. And so the agreement is just a package of legal texts. I think added to that is political attention span. We are in an era that is dominated by media slogans rather than nuance. Everyone wants, one weird trick for countering belly fat. Nobody wants to hear my 99 problems that my border stakeholders are having for everything from repositioning trucks to border paperwork. leaders want, big slogans, big initiatives, and nobody wants to go after those small but essential elements that would really improve our regional competitiveness. So, can this agreement be saved? Yes. But it is, as we've heard, the most successful integrated relationship in the world. But I think it needs to be repackaged, repurposed to address modern problems and contemporary challenges. We need a fundamental rethink of how the trilateral trade agreement can help manage a global migration crisis and rising illicit trade. We need to look at collective action. You just mentioned bilateral action on steel versus China. I want to see trilateral action on steel versus China. We need meaningful attention to those 99 problems I mentioned, whether they're non-tariff or regulatory or infrastructure. I'm delighted to see that the US and Canada are moving forward in conversations about a regulatory cooperation council, 3.0. We need to be thinking more seriously about the primacy of the digital economy and how we can develop collaborative mechanisms within North America to strengthen and govern rising technologies, artificial intelligence, smart supply chains, e-commerce, and quantum computing, to name a few. And finally, I'm an advocate of looking at opportunities to expand the agreement to new members and building, expanding, entrenching the economic competitiveness of the Americas. I think that we can find ways to rebrand USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC as a problem-solving tool for today rather than a relic of the past that we are attempting to resuscitate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Meredith, please.
Great.
Look forward to your comments.
Thank you. And I'd like to congratulate both Tony and Diego on their report that they've just released. Going last means I try not, I'll try and say some things that haven't already been said. I agree with a lot with what the panelists have already said. I'll just make a couple of points. So I think the first thing I would say kind of states the obvious, but which we sometimes overlook as we start talking about the review, which is that I think what we need to be doing over the next 6 months to prepare for the review is different than what we need to be doing after January 2025, which is going to change again when we get into that official 1-year period leading up to the possible renewal date, which is July 1st, 2026. So there's a whole bunch of things we should be doing a year from now, but I think we need to be doing some different things right now. And this is because the outcome of the US election is actually quite consequential to how this review is going to go. At the same time, I really don't think that means that we should be waiting until the US election outcome to actually get moving. And this is a view that I hear not infrequently, both in Ottawa and from American officials. Oh, we just have to throw our hands up and say, oh, we'll just have to wait and see who's going to be in power. And I don't hear this from the business community in either country. I think they're actually quite animated and want to get moving. This is very much a view that I hear from the bureaucracy. And I think that doing that, waiting, is actually a really wrong-headed approach because it both loses us a whole bunch of precious time to be doing what we should be doing right now, but also I think it would increase the role and influence of whoever that president-elect is if we just kind of wait until they're in power to define how this process is going to look. I don't think that would be good for Mexico or Canada, and I don't think it's good for stakeholders. So some of the things I think that we should be doing over the next 6 months really are focused at the technical level. And I think it's Mexico and Canada that largely need to be proactive around pushing for this agenda. So in the next 6 months, I think we should be doing things like developing the review process, the issues that Juan Carlos mentioned. We all need to be continuing to implement USMCA in good faith and adhere to those dispute settlement rulings that have already come out. So, I think in particular about Canada. I don't believe that Canada is implementing the dairy TRQ the way that it should be. And as a result, it's putting a target on us for the review, and we should be handling that differently. There's also trade irritants that just frankly can't wait until the review, and Diego mentioned this. You know, a new issue that's kind of an old issue that keeps coming back, which isn't softwood lumber. It's country of origin labeling on beef and on meat, and we just can't wait for the review to kind of fix this problem. So that's something that for Canada we need to get going on now. In areas that we know the three countries are going to continue to disagree on how USMCA is implemented, I think the mature thing to do would be to develop trilateral working groups now and address those issues productively, constructively now. And so one of those issues, unfortunately, I think is rules of origin on autos. For a long time, I said the Americans need to abide by the ruling. Clear they're not going to. They've said they're not going to. And to be fair to the Americans, I think there are some other issues that have almost overtaken the importance of the ruling around the complexity of electric vehicles or not, and Chinese investment in EVs. And so I think that we should just get going on a conversation around that that's going to work for all three countries. I think to the point Laura raised, that we should be developing a list of new areas of trade that are important in all three countries, and that USMCA doesn't actually address particularly well. So digital privacy, AI, export bans is something that free trade agreements generally haven't focused on, but we saw during the COVID pandemic that the United States wanted to ban exports to its neighbors of certain goods. So those are all things that I think that we should be looking at now and can get moving on now. And the bottom line here is that I think that the more successful USMCA is perceived to be now, the more future-proofed it's going to be from anti-trade sentiment that we see moving forward. So I'll stop after this, which is that to come full circle, I think that despite what I said about things we should be doing now, we have to be really aware of the broader political context. And when the political level in all three countries gets really involved in the USMCA review, they are going to make linkages between USMCA and the various bilateral irritants that we have in our countries that are unrelated to trade. So Juan Carlos mentioned this, Laura to some extent. You know, things like migration and border issues with Mexico. Today on the hot seat is Canada over defense spending. And increasingly, I believe that free trade with the United States is being linked to these kind of values and alliances. And to Laura's point, you know, I fully agree that we couldn't achieve NAFTA today or USMCA today if we didn't have the long history of it. And so given that that is the psyche that's really overtaking a lot on both sides of the political spectrum, I think that our larger bilateral relationships are being evaluated as part of the USMCA review. And as a result, it's not just trade officials that need to be aware of that. All of the parts of government need to be aware of that, because it's other parts of government that are off doing activist things that create issues for trade officials and vice versa. And so we can't just be thinking about subsidies and TRQs and anti-dumping. We also need to make sure that our governments are thinking about those broader issues, how they're inevitably going to get inserted into the review, and what we're going to do about it when the time comes. I will stop there, Ambassador.
Thank you, Meredith. That's great. Well, we have a whole bunch of things we can talk about here. I think, Meredith, you're right. We should try and break up the agenda between what we should try and do between now and the review starting, and then at the same time we can talk about what we should do at the review. But there are a lot of concrete things we can try and make some progress on. And as Juan Carlos said earlier, we should get agreement on what we're going to talk about during the review itself. So that's sort of two segments of that, and we can have that divided up in a timeline for sure. It seems to me that a lot of the issues that people raised revolve around, in part, around how do you mobilize the stakeholders in USMCA and in North American collaboration to actually weigh in. Because this is going to be in the end a political issue. We can have the trade people negotiating and everything, but one thing I was always reminded of when I would sit into the negotiations, it was that political aspect that usually tilted the trade negotiations one way or another, or even if the trade negotiators were focused on something else, when they got a big weigh-in from the US Congress or from others, that push those negotiations. So we're going to have to look at that. And it seems to me the biggest sort of area of absorbing those shocks and keeping people focused is if you have the actual stakeholders who benefit from USMCA more mobilized. And for those of you from Mexico, remember that your colleagues who worked on NAFTA always bring up how they mobilized in the United States to go around for a year or so to build support for signing NAFTA, which they did do. And then afterwards they stopped. But it just again shows the importance of doing that. So let me first just invite a couple of comments on how might we get more people whose livelihoods depend on this trade and depend on improving competitiveness. Are there a set of steps to get them more involved and keep them more involved? I mean, we've tried over the years. It's not easy to do until people get really scared. I'm just going to say that they lose things, but maybe I invite some thoughts about that. How do you invite this broader audience in Congress, in the private sector, elsewhere? Laura, you have your hand up.
I do, because this is very relevant to one of the initiatives that's going on in Canada, and I'm sure in Mexico as well, in this Team Canada initiative. Canadians are very concerned about not just what happens with the next US election, but how that economic and trade relationship is managed over the coming years as we go through the review. And the challenge, we've got Mexicans, as you mentioned, we've got Canadians running the roads, taking meetings in any Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club in the US that will have them. The challenge, though, for all of these foreign businesses and foreign politicians is attracting the ire of U.S. trade antagonism, political antagonism. And Canadians don't like to be distinguished as foreigners and foreign companies. And if they start opening their mouth too much, people might realize that the T in TD is for Toronto. And so that how do you take a public stance in promotion of trade and not become a target yourself is a challenge that folks are facing now. U.S. domestic industries are facing that now, just as they were after the first election of Donald Trump. I think it's one of those go as a group issues where you need to have collective voices, aligned industry out of all three countries, local, state level, municipal level, governors and mayors saying, hey, this trade and this investment from Canada and Mexico, it's important to my region, and this is why we ought to continue to support the NAFTA. I think it's got to be collective action, and it can't be sort of hit and run.
Thank you, Laura. Beatrice.
Thank you, Tony. One thing that happened that was, and you observed, Tony, was that when NAFTA was negotiated, the three business sectors of the countries were very well coordinated, and that disappeared because the agreement was functioning very well. And then came the Brazilians and the Indians and the Chinese business chambers that took that space for a long time. Fortunately, I think that was reorganized when the USMCA was negotiated. And since that has not been long ago, I think that their activity has remained, and that is fortunate, and that the awareness of what this represents and the risks that this represents, I think in itself will bring them together. What will be a challenge, and we saw it as it has been mentioned, that with governments such as those of Trump or the one we have in Mexico with López Obrador, in which there's specific threats to specific companies when they decide to go another way, that could intimidate perhaps. And I think that can be avoided if the associations and chambers participate more and they really joined forces to bring collective proposals to the table. They should be brave, but the associations help because it's not a confrontation between companies and government. It's between sectors, and the other thing that was mentioned, well, I'll keep that. I would like to mention later the institutional framework and how to do this, but I'll let the others give their opinion with regard to this specific question.
Thank you very much, Meredith.
Just a couple of additional points. Laura mentioned the Team Canada approach, which is great, but it's largely focused on the Americans. So something that needs to be happening in Canada is that Canadian business needs an opportunity to tell Canadian government what it's interested in for the renewal process. So domestic stakeholder consultations are needed. Mexico has officially already launched its stakeholder consultations, but then the election happened. So I'll be honest, I don't know whether they've kind of paused or whether they're already starting. Canadian government claims that they're about to trigger stakeholder consultations, but we haven't. Since I've been told that, we haven't seen it actually happen. And then the other thing is that our legislatures are all going to become involved at one point, and this is a question that was asked in the Q&A. Canada has already begun a study in the House of Commons and has heard from dozens of witnesses already around their interests for the review, everything from the steel industry to the dairy industry, as well as trade experts. Congress, those hearings will also ramp up and that will start as well. But then just to agree with Beatrice's comment that I do think all three the business community in all three countries where they have shared interests actually need to get louder and need to be proactive in talking about this. There seems to be a view right now that everyone should just be super quiet and not say the word USMCA. And I'll defer to Americans that perhaps have a better sense of what's going on in the United States around this. But that's not at all what the business community would like in Canada. In Canada, they want more attention and interest in the review and a feeling that government is actually listening to the things that they want advanced.
Well, thank you very much, Meredith. Juan Carlos.
Very briefly, Ambassador, thank you. I don't disagree with anything that has been said, but I do believe that we need to change the speech and make it more local. This speech that's been thrown around, and I myself confess that at some point I was the heralder of that. Trade is good in essence, and you shouldn't be worried too much about this or that or the deficit. That speech is no longer really making the trick of convincing people and making people even participate on this. Sometimes it actually has the opposite effect. So we need to change the speech, that's for sure. We have to make it more local, certainly. And we are probably in need of going to places that we usually don't go. I mean, we all love to be invited and go and speak in Washington and Chicago and Mexico City, but let's go to North Dakota or let's go to Aguascalientes or to Saskatchewan. We need to go to more places, and it won't come from the government. It has to be the stakeholders. Maybe this calls for a large trilateral USMCA organization. I don't know. It's just an idea, but certainly waiting is not an option, as Meredith says.
Thank you very much. We have a number of very good questions in the Q&A, some of which we've touched on now about the role of Congress, the role of the other legislatures. There are a number of requirements for USTR to start consulting, which they haven't done either, Meredith. So Canada is actually out in front in announcing its stakeholder consultations. They still have to do it, and I'm sure it's still up in the air in Mexico since they're still changing government right now. But we will start seeing more attention, I'm sure, in the fall as we go forward here. But one of the things I just wanted to ask, which is I'm going to touch on, Beatrice, I think you said you want to talk about the institutional aspects of this. It seems to me that the three trade ministries have been overwhelmed by trying to thoroughly implement USMCA. There are a whole bunch of parts of USMCA that have not that they've been violated, they just haven't been activated, right, to work on, like regulation, one big important area. And I think this has to do with just not having enough people to do all the things that need to be done. So there's an institutional problem with inside governments to actually do all the work that could be done to take advantage of the opportunities. So of course, saying you focus on the highest priorities and the problems, understandable. But going forward, that's an important issue. And similarly, as a number of you have written on and talked about, if you have a whole bunch of these important issues that are being run by other agencies in the government and are outside of USMCA, how do you institutionally connect them together? I mean, we could just look at the one where the three governments have actually started doing significant things in the semiconductor industry. In the United States, that's being run by the Commerce Department, as is most of the other competitiveness activities that are going on, not by the Trade Ministry, which is a lot smaller, USDR, and just doesn't have the capacity to do this. And so then you get into all of these issues about how do you institutionally assure continuity between governments. And let's say if I remember back to the Obama administration, we had a lot of North American dialogues between various ministries. They ended during the Trump administration. Some of them have been restarted now, but it's not sure they'll continue. So maybe I just ask a little bit to complement what we talked about, and this includes Congress. Of course, USDR has to report to congressional committees, but how do you involve Congress? How do you involve the Mexican legislature? How do you involve the Canadian legislature? Maybe if I can just invite some thoughts and comments from our panelists on those broad areas. You can choose, but please.
Mhm.
Any thoughts?
Yes,
Okay, Beatrice.
yes. Well, one thing that I think it's very important is to use the institutional arrangements that are in the USMCA to conduct the revision, not a creation of new mechanisms like we saw in NAFTA's history. That most of the time, the administration spent more time putting together the institutional arrangement, and then once it was there, the new governments came in and they would undo everything and start all over again. So I think it would be very important to stick to those institutional arrangements that are there.
Thank you. Laura.
Just to add to that, I think that the institutional arrangements that are there are a quite useful framework, but we have never acknowledged the fact that there are very few purely trilateral issues. There are almost nothing where a US-Mexico-Canada conversation yields a great deal or gets down to specific problems. It is still very much a hub and spoke model. It is US-Canada talking about stuff that is relevant on the northern border, and US-Mexico talking about stuff that is relevant there. And once in a while, things circle back on things like country of origin labeling, et cetera, where there is, a trilateral approach. But if we can, as Beatrice says, use the mechanisms that exist within the agreement, but then make a concerted effort to feed bilateral conversations and dialogues wherever they come from, Commerce Department, private sector, into that formal mechanism, I think we will have something that is more closer to reality and more useful.
Well, thank you, Laura. But you've actually pointed out a significant contradiction that's not going to go away. The Canadian-US border and the Mexican-US border are different. There are certain things that you could harmonize, which we have not done, like, e-customs, right? You could have the same customs rules, and you could have a mechanism that you could use for many of the three countries and things like that. We've tried to do, they're hard to do. But the specifics on each of the borders are still going to be pretty bilateral. And that's not going to go away. So that's part of the challenge that all of our colleagues still in government, our colleagues in the private sector, living and working on both of those borders, are sort of dealing with on a regular basis. And then, as you know, in the United States, DHS has the lead, Department of Homeland Security, on most border things. And so that's not USTR and it's not the Commerce Department, making it very complicated to run this. This is a really complicated relationship across North America that goes way beyond what USMCA has written in it and what the trade ministries can handle in reality. And that's not going to go away.
Oh,
So
But we
go
can
ahead.
do hard things, Tony, and we should challenge ourselves to do so.
Let's do that. That's a very good. There's a lot more we could talk about. They're wonderful questions. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we aren't going to have time to answer all of them, but this with the hard questions is a good moment to hand it over to Chris Sands. And let's ask him, the director of our Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, to take up the hard questions thought and help us pull everything together. Chris, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador Wayne. It's always a pleasure to come in for the hard questions. But I think what I took away from this panel, both the panel and frankly, the Marakeen Wayne paper, which I think if you haven't downloaded it, I know that was announced at the beginning, you can get it on the Mexico Institute website. I'm pleased to say you can also find it on the Canada Institute website at the Wilson Center. But what I took away from all of these presentations is that now is not at all too early to start asking the questions to prepare the ground for our negotiators in 2026 to do this review. 2025, I think, is going to be a crucial year in which we start to take the temperature of the three countries. The best foundation for approaching these questions always is data. And there's some questions we really need to tackle. This roster of experts and the Wilson Center itself will be there for all of our viewers, and we are going to make sure that this is not an unexamined agreement, that we aren't just reviewing it with a wave, but that we're taking a hard look at where this agreement could take us yet. And with that, I want to thank you on behalf of the Canada Institute, the Mexico Institute, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And I want to also thank our panelists, Beatrice Lesugui, Laura Dawson, Juan Carlos Baker, Meredith Lilly, Diego Maroquin, and Ambassador Tony Wayne. And also special thanks to Leila Abed and all the folks at Wilson who made this seminar possible. You can watch a recording of this event and rewatch all of these hits just shortly on our website here at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much and good day.
Good day.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all very much.
Thank you.